Hello there and welcome to another Blurbal Reasoning. Today we are talking about The Last Kingdom, the first of many books. Although from what I understand, there's kind of like a 6-book series, and then, I don't know if there's like a change in character or a change in a period of time or just a change in story arc, and then like more books go on from there. But that's definitely the 6-book package that I was sold. For the last few years, I've been reading almost exclusively fantasy with some sci-fi sprinkled in there, and I fancied a change. I'm still kind of like working my way through the 12 Wheel of Time book. But recently I've been playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla and listening to a history podcast called The History of England, which the part that I'm listening to is based around the same time period as that game and this book. And I've had these Con Iggulden Emperor series books on my Kindle for ages and ages, and I found myself thinking, isn't there another one? Isn't there another one of these famous historical fiction authors who writes around this time period that I'm currently immersed in? And no, I haven't got around to reading those Con Iggulden books yet. I will, but I thought, just out of interest, I'll look up and see how much the Last Kingdom series is, and lo and behold, 6 books for £6, not too shabby. It is also worth mentioning that I have watched the first season of the show The Last Kingdom, but that was years ago and I barely remember it, and I do remember also feeling quite lost, because while we get taught the basic history of kind of like the Viking Age of England when we are very little in primary school, that was a long time ago now, and I don't think I cared about history back then, so I didn't know a lot about the way, England used to be. It wasn't England, it was multiple, kingdoms, hence The Last Kingdom, which I think is a brilliant title because it both refers to Wessex as, the last kingdom standing against the Danes, and it also works as the last kingdom that Alfred wants to forge, the United Kingdom, or I guess he didn't call it that, England, sorry. Historians everywhere just wept. England, or England, and the kind of theory is that he passed this dream down to his son and his grandson, and they're the ones who kind of finally hammered it into shape, and that would be the last kingdom of England, is England itself, as one united kingdom. It's, again, I shouldn't have said United Kingdom, I'm sorry, but but in terms of the kingdoms that used to be, of Mercia and Wessex and East Anglia and all that, yeah, it's a fun theme to play with. So yeah, I don't know if I mentioned, but I've been wanting to get into historical fiction for some time. Not just because I'm playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla and this is set in the Viking Age and it's more of that kind of a story, but just because of Assassin's Creed in general in gaming, is it kind of opened my eyes to the idea of historical fiction. And while I already loved history, that game series has very much kind of the way in which it creates those worlds of history and immerses you in them has very much opened my eyes to wow, this is crazy, the different worlds and societies and civilizations that have existed on this planet, and the evolution of differing normality, I guess, of what you can expect out of life. And it's just normal that you're gonna grow up and be sent to war and die in a shield wall. That's just what life is, and nowadays that seems insane. So yeah, all those factors added together had me looking into The Last Kingdom, and I picked it up. So what do I think? Yeah, bloody brilliant. I've always said I enjoy stories about characters who live long lives and you can see them grow from childhood into adulthood into, I guess, being an old man or an old woman, and kind of reflecting on their life, with maybe some regrets, maybe some, I should have had a little bit more foresight on this, or looking back on this, it's kind of obvious that things were this way. That is exactly what this is. This reads like a memoir or an autobiography, as if, Uhtred, son of Uhtred, actually, wrote down his life, and we dug it up, and it was perfectly preserved, and we just got to read it all. Obviously, I'm not going, oh wow, this is real. I'm not stupid, but it's fun to kind of immerse yourself in the fantasy that it is real. And I really appreciated that Bernard Cornwell added a historical note at the end to kind of say, this is what happened, this is what I embellished. That really speaks to me of someone who knows that people will point out these things, but also B, that people will care about these things who may not know this, and that he might have some sort of duty to kind of tell them, like, just so you know, I brought Obo's death ahead by a year to fit in better with the events of the story. I should probably tell people that. I love that, because I remember reading the Wikipedia article on Gladiator, the movie Gladiator, and just the amount that, like, there was an entire section that was like historical inaccuracies, and just the amount of blatant repainting of known history because it would be better for Hollywood was, I just read all that. I went, why did I watch this fucking movie? Historical accuracy isn't, make it or break it for me. It's not like it has to be 100% historically accurate all of the time. I just mentioned I like the Assassin's Creed games and they have the gods as real things in there. But if I look at something and it smacks of like, oh, we like the idea of this time period, but we're not going to do any research into it. We're just going to regurgitate the common tropes and misconceptions and do our own thing with it. I will probably avoid it. I find it more interesting when there's a through line of truth for a story like that. So yeah, I love that it's written like memoirs, and also it's got the way this is written, there are a lot of run-along sentences. Like, there are a lot of sentences that just keep going and going and going. And I don't think that's because Bernard Cornwell isn't a good writer. I think it's because he's writing as Uhtred, and I think it works to great effect. For instance, here's a line pretty much at random. Even at 9 years old, I understood that a good Christian should not boast of being spawned by a pagan god, but I liked the idea of being a god's descendant, and Ealdwulf often told me tales of Woden, how he had rewarded our people by giving us the land we called England, and how he had once thrown a war spear clear around the moon, and how his shield could darken the midsummer sky, and how he could reap all the corn in the world with one stroke of his great sword. It very much feels like I am listening to an old Uhtred tell me his story. And he's not a man of wise learning and words and academia. He is he is more of a warrior and stuff, and he was forced to learn to write and read by Alfred for various reasons. So the writing style fits, it makes sense, and I love that when we get to combat, it's utilized to great effect, because some of these sentences run on for like half the page, but it's just like, and then his axe was ahead of me and I ducked, and then he swung, and as he swung I grabbed his shoulder, and and it just keeps going and going and going, and it really adds to the frenetic and frantic nature of the combat of a shield wall. It really sells it well, and it's been a while since I've read something where the writing style kind of adapts to the storyteller in that kind of a way, and the scenes as they need it in that kind of a way, and I think it's really well done. Also, Uhtred is a very well crafted character, because through his eyes alone, because he is the only POV we get through this book, it's brilliant that Bernard Cornwell chooses to kind of like have him show us both the Saxon point of view and the Dane point of view multiple times throughout the story, and therefore Uhtred is both kind of like the alderman, right? Of the alderman Uhtred of Bebbanburg, and he is also Uhtred Ragnarsson. He's kind of got these dual identities which are kind of like conflicting within him a lot of the time, especially when he's around the age of like 18 or so, and Ragnar's like, come with me and avenge my dad, and then on the other side you've got Alfred who's like, come with me and help fight the Danes, and like he's got, his heritage and his blood pulling his allegiance towards Alfred, and then he's got his love and his vengeance pulling him towards Ragnar, and like seeing him choose the choice he makes and how that affects the story going forward is brilliant. But also, just from our point of view, it's brilliant because we both get to see the Saxon way of life and the Dane way of life, the Viking way of life, for want of a better term, because the Vikings weren't just the Danes, but in this book they are kind of portrayed as all being the Danes. The Norse get a few mentions, but still. But then they were only Vikings when they were at sea. It's a whole thing. And if I get anything wrong here, feel free to comment below, because as Ralph Wiggums once said, I'm learning. But it is kind of crazy to me. I'm thinking, like, as I'm reading through this, the kind of mystery of where is Uhtred at the end of his life writing this, like, it's kind of cool because every now and again you get snippets of like, oh, and sometimes I hire a guy to sing for me. I'm like, okay, so clearly you are a lord and you have a hall and you have a place where you hire people to come and sing for you. So it's interesting to get snippets of future Uhtred's life. And I'm like, so where are you that you can just write openly about the fact that at one point you fought with the Danes and you killed a bunch of Saxons? Maybe he's just chronicling, I'm leaving that in. Maybe he's just chronicling everything down for after he dies. because he's quite a prideful character. He's got this pride about him of like, firstly, this Saxon heritage. We see that from when he's a boy and he's talking to the blacksmith, and then the things he does in battle and the journey he takes to reclaim Bebbanburg. But he kind of like talks even as future Uhtred about reclaiming Bebbanburg. So I have to wonder if there's going to be a point later in the books where it stops being kind of a look back on his life and starts being, and now I will take my place, and it becomes like present tense storytelling or something, which would be pretty cool. I'm all in. If you couldn't tell, I'm invested. Speaking of Uhtred's pride, by the way, he says, "The preachers tell us that pride is a great sin, but the preachers are wrong. Pride makes a man, it drives him, it is the shield wall around his reputation, and the Danes understood that. Men die, they said, but reputation does not die." Well, I've got to say, if I do have one criticism about this book, it's maybe that in kind of like retelling Uhtred's story from the eyes of future Uhtred, sometimes we're left at a bit of a disconnect from him emotionally, because I don't know, like stuff will happen with Breda, and it almost feels like it's his emotions are a little bit left out of it, and that might just be because future Uhtred doesn't want to talk about his emotions, and then or he'll say things like, I think at one point he says something along the lines of, "Oh, I'm recounting things here as if I just kind of went along with it, but I must have been terrified." So he is an unreliable narrator in some senses, which is fine. It's good to do that in fiction sometimes. But the problem I have with it is he talks very rarely about his desire to reclaim Bebbanburg, and it almost feels like that's part of his later life. And I can't see that driving a lot of young Uhtred's actions as much as his storytelling might kind of insinuate that it does. Yeah, I guess I'm just not sold on young Uhtred being obsessed with Bebbanburg like he sometimes decides to tell us he is. But yeah, his loyalties are whimsical and he lies without remorse. Sometimes he lies for fun. "You are a sign from God, Uhtred," Alfred said fervently. "Do you say your prayers?" "Every day, Lord," I said, and did not add that those prayers were addressed to Odin. And he will happily kill a bunch of Saxons to impress the Danes, and then he will happily kill a bunch of Danes to appease the Saxons. And I think that's interesting for a character, because it kind of speaks to this more, this age where ethics are different, or I guess ethics are non-existent. The only ethics that kind of really exist are through religion, and that's, flawed for multiple reasons, as is shown in the book. Or I suppose through honour and a sense of honour, as we see with the feud between Ragnar and Kjartan, which of course carries its own problems too. And there's no sense of like, I deserve to give these people my loyalty, and these people deserve to live and not die. There's a few times where it's kind of awkward, where, Uhtred's fighting on one side and Ragnar the Younger is fighting on the other side, and they almost meet, and he's like, "Oh, I sure hope I don't have to kill Ragnar, my brother." But when they do meet, Ragnar's just like, "Meet me back here tomorrow at dusk," and despite the fact that they were just like enemies, killing each other, I guess, in terms of like their sides, the next evening they're just like, "Yeah, okay, who cares about that? Hey, how's it going? Who killed my dad?" And then they part as friends and brothers once again. It's great. It's such a twist, or not a twist, but it's such a refreshing change from like the traditional heady faction stuff you find in like fantasy, and like they're the enemy and I could never see them as anything other than the enemy. It's so much more flexible and fluent in this world. Fluid. And also, I did just briefly mention religion there. I do really like how, as part of Uhtred's kind of like dual identity, he isn't Christian. He's very much pagan. He believes in the Norse gods and stuff, and he wants to be a Skeadugungun. Did I pronounce that correctly? So he's almost more Saxon than he is, Dane in that respect, but he's still not Christian. And, the Christians are presented through Uhtred's narrative as being quite farcical, as, we see the death of King Edmund, and it is presented almost comedically, of like, he's like, "My god is so powerful, he could protect me, even if you struck me with arrows." And then the Danes are like, "Alright, go on then." He's like, wait, no." And they're like, "Nah, we'll convert to Christianity if you survive, but we're doing this." I think it's a really good portrayal of some of the failings of the era, of relying too heavily on religion and faith and using it to justify certain decisions which are unlawful and unethical, I guess by modern standards at least. But at the same time, it's still very heavily biased, because it's not like Uhtred's an atheist. He still has a faith system. He still believes in, these gods. So I guess if we're going to talk about factionism and tribalism, Uhtred might not feel that way regarding Danes or Saxons, but he certainly feels that way regarding religion. King Edmund of East Anglia is now remembered as a saint, as one of those blessed souls who live forever in the shadow of God. Or so the priests tell me. In heaven, they say, the saints occupy a privileged place, living on a high platform of God's great hall, where they spend their time singing God's praises. Forever. Just singing. Bjorka always told me that it would be an ecstatic existence, but to me, it seems very dull. But even that's not completely black and white, because he has quite a good relationship with Father Bjorka. Bjorka? I don't know how to pronounce these names, I'm sorry. Like, obviously, Uhtred's like, I hated him, he forced me to read, he was always complaining, he was always, talking about God, he always wanted me to be a godly Christian and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, you do get the sense that, he's not rude to him, he's not horrible to him, they have some banter, and while a lot of it reminds me almost of Good Omens with Aziraphale chiding Crowley. It kind of reminds me of that, but, maybe that's why I'm picking up kind of friendship vibes, because it reminds me of that dynamic so strongly. But I would really appreciate it if in the future, if Bjorka dies in like book 4 or 5 or something, if Uhtred stops and goes, man, I actually really liked that guy. I guess you could argue that Bjorka probably reminds Uhtred of Bebbanburg. That being said, knowing Uhtred's character, maybe he'd just be like, well, that was dumb. Now, one thing I've written down here in my notes is that despite having quote-unquote alien ethics, a lot of what Uhtred says is somehow relatable, at least in terms of having a goal to strive for, and striving for manhood and that kind of thing. Maybe it's just because I'm a dude and I'm the target audience for this book, but yeah, this like coming of age story, despite Uhtred very much being a warrior and if I met him, I would not like him in real life. As a character, as a fictional character, I appreciate him and I really like him. It's weird how fiction does that to us, isn't it? It's like how you can like Walter White in Breaking Bad. If he was a real life person, you would hate him. He would be a horrible person. He would be horrendous. I think he was like semi-based on a real life criminal or something. But like when you're watching his tale, you're like, yeah, you're kind of rooting for him at points. You're like, yeah, go Walter, fuck him up, show him. Now, despite this being a book written by Uhtred of Bebbanburg, ostensibly, in narrative, there are some surprisingly poetic descriptions. I'm going to go see if I can pull up some. I took a lot of highlights of this book as I read it on Kindle. I'm going to see if I can find some. So yeah, here we go. Just occasional things like random descriptions of the dawn and stuff, like the sky was ribbed with clouds, high and grey pink, scudding before the storm's dying wind. That goes hard! When he's talking about fighting. The joy of it, the sword joy. I was dancing with joy, joy seething in me, the battle joy that Ragnar had so often spoken of, the warrior joy. If a man has not known it, then he is no man. So yeah, there's some actual fire lines in this, and I might have already been quoting some to you. My plan now is to go back through when I'm listening through this and to add quotes as I go. So there you go, there's a peek behind the curtain. Another thing I love about this book is how well structured it is. I feel like we have such clear chapters in Uhtred's life, and we see how every single one of them shapes him. We see his Saxon upbringing, and we learn of his dad, and we learn of Uhtred kind of like not really having a place as this second son, and he wasn't even called Uhtred until his brother died and all that stuff. We see him as first a prisoner and then a son of the Danes, and how he grows up in that society, and how his feelings of almost fatherly love for Ragnar complicate his identity as a Saxon. We see him grow into a man and learn how to fight, and we see him flee from his home as it gets burned down, and that's when he kind of gets reintroduced into Saxon life, and it's just so well done. And it feels like every character that's there is there for a reason. And it feels like every event that happens directly leads into the finale of this book alone. And like there was so much great foreshadowing with Raven saying never ever fight Ubba, and Uhtred's dreams of being a scared Dugungun, which I'm definitely saying wrong, kind of tying into his idea for his final plan against the Danes. There's a really beautiful kind of closing remark. I'll quote part of it. But on that spring day in 877, I remembered my childhood's harp and how its strings would quiver if just one was touched. It was not music, of course, just noise, and scarcely audible noise at that. But after the battle in Pedrodon's Valley, it seemed to me that my life was made of strings, and if I touched one, then the others, though separate, would make their sound. I thought of Ragnar the Younger, and wondered if he lived, and whether his father's killer Kjartan still lived, and how he would die if he did, and thinking of Ragnar made me remember Brida, and her memory slid on an image of Mildred, and that brought to mind Alfred and his bitter wife Aelswith, and all those separate people, were a part of my life, strings strung on the frame of Uhtred, and though they were separate, they affected each other, and together they would make the music of my life. He then goes on to confess that he is lonely in his old age, I guess, and says, "We are all lonely, and all seek a hand to hold in the darkness. It is not the harp, but the hand that plays it," which very much ties into his kind of mantra that destiny is all, and that fate kind of like the three spinners at the foot of the great tree Yggdrasil, I believe. They've been spinning his fate. And I love how while this is telling Uhtred's story, and it almost feels like the story of Alfred and what he's doing is happening in the background, these books are kind of like created to tell Alfred's story, as Bernard Cornwell himself says in a historical note. But just straight up writing about Alfred and what he did, it would just kind of make it a history book. So it's more interesting to invent this character and how his travels through the world would have happened, and how someone's notions of identity and faith and stuff would have been shaped during those times, and how they might differ from what people might expect having read purely historical records. I'm absolutely floored by how good this book was. I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads, and I plan to continue reading through. I've already started book 2, actually. The one thing that keeps kind of ticking away in the back of my mind is, okay, so in the first book we covered Uhtred's first 20 years of life, and I get it, a lot of that was him growing up. It would be weird to kind of cut a book off in the middle when he's still a kid, but I look at how many books there are in the future and I go, how is there still so much to see? What happens in those books? Does the pacing fall off a cliff? Or, as I'm suspecting, because I have seen scraps of blurbs, I haven't stopped to read them, but as I'm scrolling past them, I've seen people talk about like, oh, and then Uhtred is now going to do this in his journey and that kind of thing. Part of me wonders, like, does the narrative, and don't tell me, but does the narrative then change to his son at some point? Do we, like, I know there's kind of like a 6-book arc. Maybe the 6-book arc ends with this Uhtred's death, and then it continues onwards, because Bernard Cornwell in his historical note at the end of this very much talks about how this story is meant to showcase Alfred and his son and his daughter and his grandson, and like their kind of like forging of England. And I'm like, I don't think Uhtred's gonna live that long. I know he's a bit younger than Alfred, but is he just going to be an old man for most of the final books in the story? So I have this pet theory that the storytelling may fall on Uhtred the Younger, Uhtred, son of Uhtred, son of Uhtred, son of Uhtred, rightful lord of Bebbanburg. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to end it there. Rambled long enough. Absolutely delighted with this book. And yeah, can't wait to read more. Thank you for listening. And let me know what you think about The Last Kingdom down below, and I will see you in whatever I make next.